Welcome to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. This is your host, Bill Frezza. We're delighted to have with us today a friend and mentor whose inspiration and guidance convinced yours truly to take time out from the trenches of the venture capital business to wade back into the world of policy, politics, and punditry. John Tamny is the editor of Forbes Opinions and RealClearMarkets.com, as well as a senior economic advisor at H.C. Wainwright and Toreador Research and Trading. John, welcome to the show.
Hey, Bill, great to be here.
I'm going to kick off our conversation by reading the lead of your recent Forbes piece titled, China's Ghost Cities Have Nothing on the Ghost Country That Is the U.S. And here are your words. China's rise as an economic powerhouse is one of the happiest stories of modern times. Though its citizens once struggled in horrific ways under the brutal thumb of a totalitarian government, now its people are increasingly enjoying the fruits of capitalism. And while its naive detractors would say otherwise, capitalism loves poor people more than anyone, as China's leap from extreme poverty reveals. John, why do some people see the transformation of a communist country with 1 billion people chanting death to America into a valued trading partner, creditor, and supplier of billions in inexpensive manufacturing goods as a bad thing?
It's a mystery to me because, let's face it, as individuals, we are all free traders. If we could not trade freely, we'd live lives of unrelenting drudgery. In my case, I trade my writing, my editing, my oversight of a website for the apartment I live in, the car I drive, the clothes I wear. If I had to provide for all those things, I'd be intensely poor. And so the beauty of China's embrace of market capitalism is that means that our paychecks buy a lot more than they used to, that we, for the labor we engage in as individuals, get to have a lot more than we used to. Would we be worse off if Mexico were a rich country on our border, or are we better off because Mexico is poor? I think the answer is self-evident. China is no different. That China has joined the global economy is something that accrues to us because it means that we're working together on the path to creation of massive amounts of wealth and goods that we can buy.
And what kind of tribalism leads people to think differently about buying a pair of jeans from someone in the next state from buying a pair of jeans from someone in Mexico or buying a pair of jeans from someone in China?
I can't say for certain. I think there is something about country borders that maybe makes us think differently, but my greater view of the matter is that any time we're living through what is now a limp economy, people are going to look for boogeymen. They're going to be looking for a reason that so many individuals are hurting. And so the logical thing to do is to say, okay, it can't be that producer next door in Tennessee next to Arkansas. Let's blame it on the Chinese. This is another reason I think that economic growth is so important. It's so important that we get the basics to economic growth right, because if we do, Americans would be so happy they'd have jobs and they'd have lots of opportunities for other jobs. They wouldn't be worrying about something that's profoundly good for the world and for the United States, which is China's economic health.
Well, growth covers a lot of sins, and we saw that during the Reagan administration. There was a lot that was going wrong, but we had so much growth we were making up for it. Answer this, though. If you are a unskilled laborer, if you have nothing to offer to the world but the brute force of your arms, isn't it terrible to have to suddenly compete with 1 billion Chinese?
I don't think it is. Figure by that definition, a lot of Americans suffered mightily when we evolved from pretty much an all-agricultural economy into a manufacturing one. It didn't hurt Americans then. If you look at free trade historically, what it does is it doesn't create jobs as much as it creates better jobs for people to engage in. It pushes us up in the labor force stream. You look at a place like Silicon Valley, it's not just that Silicon Valley creates Google and Facebook and YouTube and Intel and all these interesting companies. It's all the small businesses that get to cluster around those companies. So even if you're not technologically skillful, even if you're not brilliant with a computer, you're still in a perfect world going to be near an Intel because so many businesses open up and are able to be successful precisely because they're clustered around.
Even if you just feed them lunch.
Even if you just feed them lunch. Look, let's face it, everyone does things differently. Everyone's got a different skill. And that's the beauty of free trade. It means that you can specialize in what you're best at. It may be that you're best at being a massage therapist. It may be that you're best at whitening teeth. What it means, though, is if Intel is very successful, you can offer up what you're best at to their very well-to-do workers.
So why do so many politicians, both today and throughout history, hate free trade?
Because it's easy in the near term to make what is a diluted point. That is, okay, those people are taking jobs from you. Those people in that other country, they are creating something better than you are, and they're taking your jobs. Let's close the borders. But that's a very short-term election cycle point that misses the long term, that there are no companies and no jobs without investment first. Investment follows the countries that are specializing, that are doing what they're comparatively best at. So if you look at it from a long-term perspective, which is almost impossible for most politicians to do, you'll say, okay, this is great. The Chinese will do what they're best at. The Indians will do what they're best at. We will do what we're best at. That will make us most profitable. It will attract the most investment and get us the best pay we can possibly get for what we're doing, which is what we're comparatively good at.
But what about the argument that says all of these low-wage workers in China, or used to be low-wage workers in China, the wages are going up now, that all these people are being exploited?
Exploited is a relative term. Lest we forget, these Chinese workers once had no jobs at all, or if they had jobs, they were brutal ones working in fields. All wages start out low. I look at myself as a writer. Thank goodness I was exploited in my early years. I was never paid for my writing, but it gave me a chance to write for the public so that now I can be paid for it. Work is no different of any kind. Sometimes you need to just really about every time, you need to start at the bottom to get the experience and to show employers what you're good at so that you can command higher wages down the line.
Well, this gets into the argument we're fighting now about should the minimum wage be raised? Should we take the first rung on that ladder and make it higher up?
No, it's a very, very cruel thing to do because, once again, when you set a floor to wages, you're making it impossible for the least skilled to enter the labor force at all. Again, I go back to myself as a writer. Thank goodness there were people willing to exploit me early on because that experience I got made it so that I could command higher wages for writing down the line.
No.
And it's no different with a minimum wage. Sometimes workers don't have the skills. They don't have the skills necessary to be hired. But how cruel to place a wage floor on them that makes it impossible for them to be hired at all.
Well, it's funny. I look at my own life. How grateful am I that my grandparents were attracted to sweatshops in the garment industry in New York. Otherwise, I wouldn't be an American today.
That's right. Americans don't come to the United States, and I think all immigrants are Americans. They don't come here because they're looking for security. They come here because they're looking for opportunity. You would never come to the United States looking for security, and if that's what you got upon arrival here, it wouldn't be such an attractive place. People come to the United States because they want something better. They know that if they work hard, that eventually their work will be rewarded, and that's why we're such a successful entrepreneurial country. This modern idea that we must create all these laws to make us safe and secure is something that contradicts what the United States has historically been all about.
So how do you explain the fact that the Democratic Party, which tends to be, in general, against free trade and against capitalist expansion, is pro-immigrant, and the Republican Party, which claims to be in favor of capitalism and free trade, seems to be anti-immigrant?
It's a very odd scenario that you're describing. I've heard, I can't prove it, that Democrats tend to be for open immigration borders because they believe it will help them at the ballot box. I think that's strange. I don't think most immigrants would want to come here to vote for people who would say, okay, if you're successful once you arrive, your wealth is going to be redistributed, which is what the Democrats tend to say. In terms of the Republicans, I would say the problem for them in modern times, it's like playing tennis against someone who's worse than you are. You're going to get worse and worse. Republicans don't have a good debate partner at this point, and it's caused them to be stupid about economics and really foolish about immigration. Immigration is what we're about. Americans, not a race. It's an ideal. And it strikes me for a Republican Party that talks up a pro-growth line, what could be better than inviting in the world's ambitious and saying, you have a place to work?
It does seem like someone flipped a coin somewhere to decide which side they were going to take on the immigration battle, and it came out backwards. It's very hard to understand.
Without question. It's one of the strangest things in modern times. If you made me dictator today, probably legalizing all work in this country and opening up the borders would be the number one thing I would do, because as Jean-Baptiste Say once put it, immigrants are treasures. To get the world's ambitious when they want to come to your country is just a hugely bullish sign that they're looking for something better, and why we'd ever want to keep them out. What we're doing is we're keeping out what makes us American to begin with.
Well, that takes us back to China. Let's look at the tale of two Chinas. If you look at Hong Kong, a barren rock with no resources, which probably in human history was the closest we've ever come to a pure free market economy, populated with refugees from China's communist revolution, who were blessed with the rule of law but not cursed with redistributive democracy. They created one of the most successful economies that we've ever seen. And now mainland China is trying to adopt some of those approaches, trying to adopt some form of capitalism, although you can't really call it free market capitalism right now. It's some strange hybrid of state and crony capitalism with the marketplace. Let's swing back around to your column, which really opened with the idea of the ghost cities. Tell us briefly what these ghost cities are in China, and what was your point comparing that to the United States?
Well, one of the arguments made against the high-growth China story is that a lot of its GDP growth, gross domestic product, is fake or it's illusory. It's these cities, these residential buildings that have been built based on government loans that have no economic purpose.
Make work.
And so, yeah, it's make work. It's digging a hole and then filling it in again, but in this case, building skyscraper residential locations that serve no real economic purpose at the moment. And I would agree that that's not something that would recommend China if the government is allocating capital in wasteful ways. And so they're called ghost cities, of course, because of this. But if you're going to criticize China for having ghost cities, let's talk about the United States. Governments have no resources. Government spending, is, if anything, is a growth retardant. 20% of what we call GDP is government spending. So based on that, you could argue that the U.S. is a ghost city on steroids. It's a growth country. All sorts of non-economic spending serving no useful purpose that the government allocates to create what it deems economic growth.
Why is that counted in the positive side of the GDP figures? Why isn't it counted as a cost and not a benefit?
Oh, you ask the question that I ask and rant about and stay up at nights about all the time. I think GDP is one of the most worthless, most Keynesian economic figures ever conceived naturally by the fraudulent profession that is economics. Government spending is always a cost. Governments don't have resources other than that which they take from us first. And government, by definition, is a lousy allocator of capital. If you knew how to allocate capital, you wouldn't work for the government. And maybe one way to look at it is who's better at allocating it, Paul Tudor Jones and Warren Buffett and Jeff Bezos, or Mitch McConnell, Harry Reid, and John Boehner? I think we know the answer to that. Government can't allocate capital, so when it spends, it's naturally subtracting from economic growth, yet in that calculation, it adds to it.
But it definitely buys votes. And if you look at where we've gone here under our redistributive democracy, it seems like a very effective way to win at the ballot box.
See, I don't think so. I really don't buy that as it applies to the United States. Americans, once again, we are a country of immigrants. We descend from people who took a risk to be here. Americans want economic growth, and it's not as though they all look at government spending and say, hey, wait a second, that's subtracting from growth, but they don't like it. The Republicans were big spenders. They controlled Congress until their voters got sick of it in 2006 and voted them out. More broadly, once again, Americans want economic growth. Logic dictates that government spending subtracts from it. And so I would say the biggest buyer of votes is growth, and so politicians should spend less.
Yeah, but John, aren't you projecting your values on others? I mean, after all, we've crossed the 50% point in the number of Americans who are getting checks from the government. We've seen food stamp recipients soar. Corporate welfare, of course, is at an all-time high. We're probably spending $160 billion a year on corporate welfare. These people are not turning that money down.
They're not turning that money down, and I'm guessing that if I walked up to you with $200, you might take it, but I don't think I'm projecting my viewpoint on the American people. I think what I'm describing is basic history. When Americans are presented with a pro-growth candidate, they vote for that person. The problem is, really, since Ronald Reagan, and you could argue Bill Clinton too, Americans haven't been presented with a pro-growth candidate. They had to choose between George W. Bush and Al Gore. Both didn't understand economic growth, so you pick your poison there. The Republicans proved what a slow-growth candidate George W. Bush was over two presidential terms, at which point voters decided, okay, we'll take Obama in this calculation. Obama ran against John McCain, hardly a pro-growth candidate.
No, that's true.
And then Obama ran against Mitt Romney. And I would argue on Mitt Romney that he was, in fact, the slower growth candidate of the two, with all his talk about getting tough on China and devaluing the dollar. I think the electorate gets it right. The problem is they haven't been given a pro-growth candidate in decades.
So this is a pathology of our duopoly lockup of the political system, where we're locked into two warring tribes who have chosen the issues they want to fight on, half of which have nothing to do with economics. They're culture war issues, which tend to distract. And as a result, what kind of choices are we left with?
I think you make a good point. I would throw into that if you made me dictator, another thing I would do is totally deregulate campaign finance. Let's face it, if you and I want to run for president tomorrow, we cannot do it. Only rich people can run for president, or people who have a really good Rolodex where they can raise $4,000 or $2,000 at a time. If we deregulated this and said that Bill Fresley, if he can find one billionaire to back him, he can run for president, I think we'd have a far more interesting political discussion than what we're having right now.
Well, it would be more competitive if there were more than two people on the ballot. I mean, isn't that the source of the problem? If there were 4 or 5 people on the ballot, you might have a range of choices.
There's no doubt you would. And in a deregulated campaign finance environment, that's what you would have. You look back to the late 60s, Eugene McCarthy was able to run for president and knock out the incumbent in LBJ precisely because he was able to find 4 rich liberals who wanted us to get us out of the Vietnam War. Today, Eugene McCarthy quite simply could not run.
So, John, this can be very confusing for people. What role do economists, professional economists, play in educating or miseducating the public?
They play a very major role in miseducating the public. One example to look at, which is recent that most people would understand and be very familiar with, was the commentary from the economics profession, which said that the government shutdown and the non-payment of the 13% of non-essential workers was actually hurting the economy. They said that the economy lost $24 billion in stimulus during the shutdown.
Yeah, we would have been better off wasting money.
Yeah, think about that. Think if a business ran like that. That, well, we're just going to keep on a lot of non-essential workers. Who cares about profits? If businesses run that way, our economy would be tragic. Investment would flow out of this country en masse. But somehow, if money reaches Washington, it takes on magical powers, according to the economics profession, which I deem utterly fraudulent. They claim that in this case, if it just reaches Washington and is wasted, and we're removing people from the productive parts of the economy so they can do work that has no discernible economic purpose, and probably, if anything, restrains growth, that somehow it's a driver of our economic
Well, it's a magic multiplier. They go out and create aggregate demand, do they not? They take their paychecks and they go spend it on things.
So listen to economists, that's exactly what they do. But let's face it, no act of saving ever detracts from demand. Unless you're putting your wealth under a mattress, your money, when you sit on it, when you leave it in the bank or you leave it in a brokerage account, is naturally reaching what the markets deem its highest use. This is quite unlike government consumption of wealth, which is just consumption. I mean, let's face it, everything we have today, from cars to computers to cell phones, is a result of savings. Every job in the world is backed by savings. Yet the government presumes that it can help us by consuming our limited capital, by consuming that savings. And the result is, what this tells us is the very government and the government spending that economists say helps our economy is the big, massive restraint to our being the great economic power that we could be.
But, John, can't they replace savings with borrowing or printing money?
Well, borrowing is no different from saving. Let's remember, we live in a global economy. A dollar is a dollar is a dollar. Whether it's saved or borrowed makes no difference. The problem is that the government presumes to spend with abandon at all. And in spending, we have to ask about the unseen. All businesses are the result of savings and investment, just as all jobs are. And so we have to ask, all that government consumption of capital over the years, how many Microsofts, Intels, and Googles were strangled at inception by all this government spending? How many cancer cures? How many heart disease cures?
You don't see that side of the ledger. And so, look, so if borrowing is the same thing as savings because you're just tapping the savings of Chinese people, what about printing? QE1, QE2, QE3, they're trying to prime the pump and expand aggregate demand by printing the money and handing it out. Why isn't that working?
Well, it doesn't work for two ways. For one, the very notion of printing money corrupts the purpose of money. The sole purpose of money, because it's not wealth, is to facilitate the exchange of wealth. It's the way that we assign value to the work we do and the investments we make. And so in printing money, what you're doing is you're robbing money of its sole purpose, which means you're going to get less transactions, less trade, less investment, because if you think that the dollars you're going to invest in the future Microsoft are going to come back in devalued terms, you're not going to make that leap or that investment to begin with. So it fails on that alone. It restrains trade, it restrains investment, it restrains job creation. But the other area in which it fails mightily, and this is what you might say is the most cruel thing about the very existence of the Fed, is the Fed presumes to save us to blunt the effects of recession. Well, it's got to be stressed that recessions are beautiful. Recessions are the sign that an economy is fixing itself.
It cleans up malinvestment.
It cleans up all the things that went wrong. Recessions are the way that you rid the economy of Webvan and the Globe.com so that Google and Facebook can get investment. If you don't have recessions, you can't have economic evolution because recessions are the only way to clear out all the bad stuff.
But people only see the jobs lost. People only see the jobs lost. They don't see the jobs that are gained later.
They only see the jobs lost, but what they don't see, but I think the electorate in a weird way understands this, when the Fed tries to blunt the effects of recession, what it's really doing is robbing us of recovery. It's robbing us of the companies of the future that would employ us and make us much better off, much healthier, more wealthy, all the things that we want.
Well, the data from this current so-called recovery certainly supports that view, but what makes economists so happy with money printing?
I would argue once again that the very notion of an economics profession is a big lie. What makes economists happy with it is they reside in the scene. They say, hey, wait a second, if we devalue the dollar, that's going to make it much easier for U.S. producers to sell their goods overseas. The problem there is the trade always balances. We can't just sell and not buy. We're selling so that we can get something in return. They also leave out that if you're devaluing the dollar, the cost of production naturally soars. Logically, you have to import a lot of things to produce the final good. Logically, you have to ship the final good to different places. It's going to make that more expensive in some instances. They also leave out the fact that companies that produce and want to sell to the world, they have employees. Well, if you're eviscerating the paychecks of employees with this devaluation, eventually they're going to ask for more in the way of payment. So you're going to always steal the benefits of devaluation with all these costs. But the biggest thing, once again, is that investors are tautologically buying future dollar income streams when they invest. If you devalue the currency, you tell investors to put their money into hiding, to put their money into the hard assets representing wealth that already exists, rather than putting their money into the stock and bond income streams of wealth that doesn't yet exist.
Well, but politically, isn't it easier to print and inflate to downward adjust wages than to deal with the strikes and the unrest if you actually had to go in and adjust wages downward directly? Look at what's happening at Greece right now. Because they can't print money, because they can't inflate, they're being forced to adjust wages downward to become competitive, and it's brutal.
I know that's the general viewpoint, but I don't buy the politics. Lenin understood this. Keynes understood it. Von Mises understood it. It's not even an ideological thing. That if you want to turn a society asunder, if you want to truly wreck it, if you want to bring out all the worst aspects of society, the quickest way to do it is to rob money of its value. History is very clear about this, so I do not buy the politics of it. I would argue that one of the biggest problems Greece has had is that it had a junk currency before the euro, but even with the euro, they weren't protecting the value of it, and in not protecting the euro's value, investment logically flows into areas that are least vulnerable to that devaluation. And so I think if Greece really wanted to help itself, it would have a quality currency. It would issue a quality one. That's the quickest way to get investment. Investment is how you get company creation and job creation.
Well, you make fun of economists, but isn't it like any other field? There's plenty to choose from. I mean, the most recent Nobel Prize was given to two economists who directly contradicted each other.
Well, I think it speaks to the fact you're an engineer, and so you know this much better than I do. We're talking about a profession, and you've hit on this in columns before, that you never have to be right to get a paycheck in it and to have a fan base. You can just say what you believe and say, well, I'm part of the Keynesian school, or I'm part of the monetarist school, or I'm part of the Austrian school, and I believe this. You don't have to prove anything. You just say it, and okay, that's your belief. There's no proof involved in economics anymore.
Well, there's no proof involved in politics, right? Because policies are judged on intentions, not results. If we judged policies on results, just about everybody in Washington would have been run out of town.
You're absolutely right.
So, John, all of this begs the question, and again, there is no free market anywhere in the world today, but all this begs the question, as we see globalization, as we see more trade around the world, we're seeing more and more income inequality. Isn't this a bad and destabilizing factor?
No, I think that income inequality is one of the most unrelentingly beautiful things the world has ever created, and rich countries naturally have income inequality. Capitalist countries naturally have it because it means that enterprise is being rewarded. When income inequality is growing, that means that lifestyle inequality is shrinking. People get rich by producing what was formerly only available to the rich. They get wealthy by mass producing it for everyone. Think of the automobile. It was once the bauble of the rich. Henry Ford made the middle class good precisely because he was able to mass produce it. He got rich for doing so and expanded income inequality. It used to be that the personal computer was something that really only the rich could conceive of owning. Michael Dell became a billionaire by mass producing something that was formerly unavailable to most people. Cell phones. In 1980, the cheapest cell phone, and really the only one, was a Motorola that cost $3,995, not to mention what you would pay to use it.
So you've gone down a laundry list of manufacturers and companies that produce real things. What about derivatives traders? They're gambling against each other. It tends to be a zero-sum game for much of it. They run up trillions in a derivatives pyramid. What value are they adding to the economy?
I think they're adding enormous value to the economy because we couldn't produce today if we couldn't move our risk around. Let's face it, if you're a farmer and your crop is corn, the existence of a derivatives market means that you can produce on an annual basis and know that you're not going to be wiped out. You can lock in certain profits. Derivatives traders are just providing price signals for all manner of things. It used to be for the longest time that there was no way to have a market signal of the ability of a company to pay off its debt, to pay off its bonds and everything. Thank goodness for credit default swaps. They gave a signal to the market saying, okay, we don't like the ability of Bank of America, as an example, to pay off its debts. You need these things in the marketplace. People dislike derivatives, but most of our economy could not work today without them. And it's got to be stressed that every economic act, everything we do is an act of speculation. Derivatives are just a way for us to lower the risk and spread some of that around.
Clearly, that's the case in the real economy. Let me make a distinction. What about all the derivatives that are totally focused on gambling on sovereign debt interest rates?
Same idea. Shouldn't there be a marketplace for the ability, gauging the ability of governments to pay off their debt? In my perfect world, governments would spend a lot less money. I think we would all like that in the world we live in. But the simple truth is, if there's going to be government debt, there's got to be a way for those who are investing in it to lay off some of that risk to someone else. And derivatives traders exist to help them do that. They create a market. Every market has a bull and a bear. That's what Goldman Sachs and most investment banks are. They are bringing together people with different points of view on the marketplace and helping them to transact. And one thing I would add to this is that people are, when they're yelling at derivatives, they're yelling at the wrong thing. Derivatives markets, for instance, for commodities used to be very sleepy. When did they become very active? When President Nixon delinked the dollar from gold in 1971. What that meant is that suddenly commodities that had been very stable for a long time suddenly were floating around in nominal value precisely because the dollar's value is floating around.
So people were hedging against the fact that their money was becoming rubber.
Absolutely. The corruption of money made derivatives trading far more essential. And so you then have to ask yourself what you've lost. Again, if we didn't have derivatives traders, we'd have to invent them. There's got to be a way to lay off risk or spread risk around. But the question has to be, since 1971, once again, how many cancer cures, how many Microsofts, how many Intels and world-changing companies, how many mass-produced private jets that the middle class could buy were never created because so many wise minds migrated into finance and the ability to make money off of the chaos that was created by floating money.
Well, the brain drain into finance is a topic I'd love to come back to you about sometime. You know, I'm still very involved with students at MIT, and it appalls me how many young people with engineering and science training get sucked off into Wall Street.
No question, but what I think you'd find if we were ever to return to stable money, there wouldn't be as much volatility, there wouldn't be as much chaos to trade on, and what you'd find is a lot of those students would go into other things. Not that Wall Street's bad. I don't think Wall Street's bad. I don't want to bail it out, but I don't think it's bad. I don't think what it does is bad. But they would go into other things because there would not be the money to be made in hedge funds, in some of these funds that trade on the chaos and that are very necessary given the world we live in.
Well, John, it's been a wide-ranging discussion. We've gone from China to Washington to Wall Street and sort of gotten a perspective which is very helpful given your perch at Forbes and Real Clear Markets. I'd like to thank you for being on the program.
Thank you very much for having me, Bill.
You've been listening to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. This is your host, Bill Frezza. We've been chatting with John Tamny, the opinions editor at Forbes.com and the editor at RealClearMarkets.com. Thanks for being with us.